Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. If you're new here, this channel exists because a lot of men come to Vietnam looking for something: a fresh start, a simpler life, a connection that feels real after too many years of the wrong kind of quiet. Some of them find it, a lot of them don't. And occasionally someone comes along whose story doesn't fit neatly into either category. And those are the ones that stay with you. Today's story is about a man named Brendan Mulcahy. He's 51 years old, from Limerick in Ireland, and he spent 22 years as an accountant. Not a romantic, not a risk taker, a man who built his entire professional life around the principle that if you look at the numbers carefully enough, the truth will always reveal itself. He didn't arrive in Vietnam on a whim. He researched, he prepared, he did something almost nobody does before they come here. Something that by rights should have protected him completely. It didn't. Brendan's story isn't a simple one, and I'll ask you to sit with the complexity of it because the easy version of this story isn't the true version. What happened to him in Ho Chi Minh City is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, not because it's dramatic, but because it's quiet. And because the part that hurt most wasn't what he lost. It was what he heard. Here's his story in his own words. I'll tell you something about being an accountant that nobody thinks is interesting, but is actually the whole thing. It teaches you to distrust the top line. Anyone can look at a revenue figure and feel good. The job, the actual job, is tracing every number back to where it came from. You follow the chain. You find the source. You don't sign off until you understand how the total was reached, not just what it says. 22 years of that. Payroll runs, quarterly audits, VAT returns, for a construction firm in Limerick that built houses and occasionally paid its suppliers in a creative sequence. I knew where every euro was supposed to be and where it actually was. And those two things were not always the same place. I thought I applied that discipline to everything. I thought it made me careful. My wife left me in the spring of 2022. 19 years. The house was in Castle Troy, a 3-bed semi, nothing special, but ours, or what I thought was ours. She'd been with a colleague for the better part of 2 years before I knew anything about it. A project manager at the same firm, which I'll give her credit for. She was thorough. The settlement was what it was. I didn't fight hard enough, my solicitor told me afterward, as if that was useful information at that point. I was tired. I was ashamed in the particular way that Irish men of a certain age get ashamed, quietly and completely, without telling anyone. Then, 6 months after the divorce finalized, the construction firm let me go. Restructuring. They called it restructuring. 18 people went in the same week, which made it feel less personal, and somehow also more so. 22 years and a card signed by the office, which I noticed had a typo in my name. Brendan with an O, 22 years. My mother died the following January. She left me a small amount, not much, but clean money. Money with no argument attached to it. Between that, the redundancy payout, and what remained after the settlement, I had approximately 58,000 euro. I want to be precise about that figure because it matters later. I was living in a bedsit in Dooradoyle. 1 room, a kitchenette, a bathroom with a shower that ran cold for the first 40 seconds, regardless of what you did with the dial. The woman below me had a television that she kept at a volume, suggesting she believed sound traveled upward. I ate a lot of toast. I watched a lot of things on my laptop that I don't remember. One evening, a Tuesday I think, late autumn, I was listening to a podcast. I don't even remember what I'd been listening to before it. Something about finance, probably. This one was an interview with a man who'd worked in the civil service in Dublin for 30 years, retired at 60 and moved to Da Nang. He was talking about his life there, the cost of a decent meal, the weather in December. The fact that he'd walked along the beach that morning and felt, he said, genuinely glad to be alive. I didn't feel inspired by that. I want to be clear about the distinction because inspiration implies something emotional, some surge of feeling. What I felt was interested. Specifically, I felt the particular interest of a man who has just been shown a set of numbers that don't match his current model. I spent 3 weeks checking what he'd said. Cost of living data, cross-referenced across 4 separate sources. Healthcare? I looked at both public and private options, read expat forum threads going back 6 years to track how costs had changed. Visa structures? Crime statistics? I made a spreadsheet because of course I did. And I ran the numbers against my 58,000 and against the monthly income I might eventually draw from a small pension that wouldn't kick in fully for another 9 years. In Ireland, that money was a waiting room. It was a bedsit and Dora Doyle and toast, and a television I could hear through the floor. In Vietnam, the column totals looked different. I didn't tell anyone I was researching it. Not my sister in Cork, not the couple of friends from the firm who'd taken me for a pint after the redundancy and texted occasionally since. It wasn't a secret exactly, as it was more that I've always been someone who arrives with the work already done. I don't like discussing things before they're decided. It invites other people's doubts in before you've finished building your own certainty, and their doubts are almost always less informed than yours. In October of that year, I enrolled in Vietnamese evening classes at a language school on O'Connell Street in Limerick City. The teacher was a young woman named Lynn, maybe 26, born in Hai Phong, and studying a postgraduate in UL. She looked at me on the first night the way people look at something that doesn't belong in a particular category. Not unkindly, just with a slight recalibration. 51-year-old accountant from Limerick, right, grand so. Vietnamese is not a forgiving language. The tones alone, 6 of them. And getting the wrong one doesn't just change the meaning, it changes it into something that can make a room full of people laugh at you, depending on context. The vocabulary is manageable, but the grammar has a logic that takes time to locate. I found it genuinely difficult, which surprised me. I'm not someone who finds things genuinely difficult as a rule. I found it absorbing for exactly that reason. 8 months, 2 evenings a week at the school, and then an hour most nights at home with a headphone set, and a Pimsleur course, and later, a tutor I found online who did video calls for €12 an hour. I passed no formal exam. I achieved no certificate. What I had by the end of it was the ability to follow a conversation at normal speed, provided the speaker wasn't using heavy regional dialect and wasn't deliberately trying to be obscure. I understood more than I could produce. That's a specific kind of fluency. Passive comprehension, outrunning active expression. It's actually a common stage in language acquisition. You absorb faster than you can respond. I was aware of it. I noted it, the way I noted things. I booked my flight in February. One-way open return, which is not a thing that exists exactly, but is the state of mind I was in. I wasn't going forever, but I wasn't going for a holiday either. I'd arranged a serviced apartment in District 7 for the first 2 months, a clean building off Nguyen Van Lynn, sensible monthly rate, nothing fancy. District 7, not District 1. I'd read enough to know that District 1 was where you went if you wanted to overpay to be around other foreigners, and that wasn't what I was after. I landed in Ho Chi Minh City on a Thursday morning in March. The heat was exactly as described. The noise was exactly as described. The traffic at the airport exit was exactly as described, and I had still underestimated it. I stood outside the terminal with my case and my carry-on, and the Grab app my niece had helped me install before I left, and I thought, right, here we are then. That was all. No great feeling, no revelation. Just a man with a carry-on bag and €58,000 and 8 months of Vietnamese, standing in 32 degrees of heat outside Tan Son Nhat Airport, getting into a car he'd booked on his phone. The driver asked me something in Vietnamese. I answered him. He glanced in the mirror, surprised. I thought, at least that part works. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of concrete and cooking oil, and something floral I never identified. The lift worked 3 days out of 4. The window looked out onto a tangle of power lines, and beyond them, a row of shop houses with signage in Vietnamese and Korean. Because District 7 has a significant Korean population, and nobody had mentioned that in the forums I'd read, which told me the forums had gaps. I had the place to myself for the first 6 weeks, and I was genuinely fine with that. I want to be honest about this part because one thing people expect a different story. The lonely man abroad, adrift without purpose, vulnerable to the first person who showed him kindness. That wasn't quite it. I had a routine within 10 days. Breakfast at a calm tam place 2 streets over, the kind with plastic stools on the pavement, and a woman who served broken rice with grilled pork and a fried egg and a bowl of broth for about 45,000 dong, which is roughly €60. I ate there most mornings. I walked a lot. I sweated through my shirts and bought lighter ones from a market off Nguyen Thi Thap. I found a coffee shop, An actual sit-down place with air conditioning, not a Highlands, something local, where I'd spend an hour each afternoon with a cafe suaja and whatever I was reading. It was peaceful, not exciting. Peaceful in a way that Dordogne hadn't been, and hadn't been for longer than I'd admitted to myself. My Vietnamese worked about as well as I'd expected, which is to say, imperfectly but functionally. The Comtam woman and I developed a transactional relationship conducted entirely in Vietnamese, which gave me more satisfaction than was probably proportionate. The Grab drivers were useful practice. Most people switched to English as soon as they clocked the accent, but some didn't bother, and those conversations, brief, practical, about traffic or weather or which way to go, were the ones I found I needed. Confirmation that the 8 months hadn't been wasted, that I'd built something that held weight. I was 3 weeks in when I found the language exchange meetup. It was listed on a Facebook group for expats in District 7, posted by someone who organized it out of what I gathered was a mixture of genuine enthusiasm for languages and a side interest in meeting foreigners. Every Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock, at a coffee shop called La Jeanne, Greenleaf, roughly, just off Nguyen Van Lien. Locals who wanted to practice English, foreigners who wanted to practice Vietnamese. 15 or 20 people, depending on the week. The posting said to bring yourself in whatever language you had. I went the following Tuesday because it seemed practical. I want to be clear on that motivation. I wasn't lonely in any acute sense. I was there to test the Vietnamese in a more sustained conversation than taxi small talk allowed. To calibrate. That's the word I used in my own head at the time. Calibrate. The cafe had wooden benches and mismatched mugs and a ceiling fan that oscillated without conviction. Someone had strung fairy lights along one wall, which served no real purpose but which I noticed. The air smelled of coffee and, faintly, of the incense from the little altar on the counter near the door. A small wooden shelf with a glass of water and an orange and a stick of incense burning in a brass holder. They were everywhere in this city, those altars. You stopped noticing them after a while, and then one day you noticed you'd stopped noticing them. There were about 18 people that evening. I took a seat at one of the longer benches, ordered a café gen from a young man who brought it without ceremony, and looked around at the room. 3 or 4 other foreigners. A young American couple, a German man about my age who turned out to be a teacher, a French woman who was there with her Vietnamese boyfriend, and therefore had no obvious need to practice anything. The rest were Vietnamese, ranging from university students with good English to an older woman who, as far as I could tell, had come primarily for the social occasion. And there was Lynn. She was sitting 2 seats down from me on the same bench, talking to a Vietnamese woman I didn't know, and she was the one who spoke to me first. In Vietnamese. Not the careful, slowed-down Vietnamese people use when they're not sure you'll follow, but normal-speed Vietnamese, directed at me as if it were the most natural assumption. She asked if I'd been to one of these before. I said no, it was my first time. In Vietnamese. She went quiet for just a moment, not long, maybe 2 seconds, and then she said, in Vietnamese, that most foreigners who came to these things only knew Xin Chao and Cam On. Hello and thank you. The tourist minimum. I said I knew a bit more than that, she laughed. Not a polite laugh. A genuine one. And then she switched to English, which I found slightly deflating, and asked where I'd learned. Limerick, I said. She thought about this. She said she didn't know where that was. Ireland, I said. On the west side of the country. Not famous for Vietnamese language instruction. She found this funnier than it warranted, and I found her finding it funny in a way I hadn't found anything in a while. Her name was Lynn. She was 38, she told me when I asked. Born in Can Tho in the Mekong Delta, moved to Saigon. She called it Saigon, not Ho Chi Minh City, the way most people who actually live there do, about 12 years earlier. She worked in logistics administration for an import-export company in District 4. She came to the meetup most Tuesdays, she said, because her English needed the practice and also because she liked the coffee here. We talked for most of the evening, in both languages, switching back and forth, her correcting my tones occasionally with the frank efficiency of someone who'd rather you get it right than be comfortable. I found her corrections useful rather than embarrassing, which surprised me about myself. She had a way of listening that I noticed, not nodding along, not waiting for her turn. Actually processing what you'd said before she responded. It sounds like a small thing. It isn't. At the end of the evening, people were exchanging numbers. She gave me hers without being asked, which I noted, then said she'd see me next Tuesday, which implied a presumption I didn't object to. I walked home through the warm District 7 evening, motorbikes everywhere, the smell of something frying from a food cart on the corner, a karaoke bar 2 streets over contributing enthusiastically to the ambient noise. And I thought about the conversation. She had laughed at the right moments. She had asked questions that suggested she'd been paying attention. She had not asked me anything about money or what I was doing in Vietnam or how long I was staying, which were the 3 questions almost everyone else led with. I turned it over the way I turn everything over. Examined it for what it was and wasn't. What it was. An interesting conversation with an interesting woman. What I told myself it wasn't. Anything more than that. Interesting, I thought. That was the word I settled on. Walking back to the apartment on the 4th floor with the unreliable lift and the unidentified floral smell. Interesting. I'm going to be precise about the first 3 months because precision is how I process things, and also because being precise about it now is the only way I can explain how a careful man ends up somewhere careless. We met at the Lausanne meetup the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. And then one evening in late April, she suggested we get dinner somewhere properly rather than nursing cafe coffee all night. There was a Bun Bo Hu place she liked on a side street near Hung Vuong in District 5. Not a tourist place, the kind with plastic tables and a handwritten menu on a chalkboard, and a woman out front who'd give you a look if you ordered wrong. We took grab bikes separately. She arrived first. I want to tell you about how she looked that evening, but I'm aware that's not really the point. The point is that she was already sitting down with 2 glasses of iced tea when I got there, which meant she'd ordered for us both without asking, which could mean presumption or familiarity, and I chose to read it as the latter. The Bun Bo Huck was excellent. Thick broth, lemongrass, the right amount of heat. We stayed 2 hours. That was the beginning of a pattern that lasted 3 months. Dinners 2 or 3 times a week. Walks along the canal in Pu Mai Hung on weekend evenings, that artificial-looking waterway lined with joggers and elderly people doing their exercises, and the occasional wedding photo shoot. She'd message on Zalo. Most people in Vietnam use Zalo, not WhatsApp, which I'd known from my research and which she seemed pleased that I knew. The messages were light, practical, sometimes funny. She sent me a photograph of a particularly bad English translation on a restaurant menu once, with no comment attached. I laughed at it for longer than I should have. In May, I suggested Vung Tau for a weekend. It's 2 hours southeast of the city by ferry or road, a beach town, working-class Vietnamese holiday destination, a few oil industry expats. Nothing glamorous. I chose it because it was close, affordable, and because I wanted to see how she handled the suggestion. Some women, I'd read, would immediately turn a weekend trip into a financial negotiation. Who pays for what, accommodation expectations, spending money. Lynn said that sounded nice and asked if I'd looked at guest houses or if she should. That was all. She paid for coffee on 2 separate occasions during those 3 months. The first time was at a Highlands Coffee near her office in District 4, which she was closer to, and which she ordered and paid for before I arrived, again presenting me with a fait accompli. The second time was at the Lausanne meetup when she got around for both of us without discussion. I noted these instances. I note this now to you as the thing that I actually thought was significant evidence. 2 cups of coffee, as if that were a meaningful audit. She asked about my divorce. Not immediately. When it was around the 6th week, we were eating com tam near my apartment, and she asked carefully whether I had been married before. I said yes. She asked if I wanted to talk about it. I said not particularly. She nodded and let it go, and then about 10 minutes later, asked one specific question. Not what happened, not how long ago, but just, are you still angry about it? I thought about it and said, honestly, no. Not angry. Just recalibrated. She seemed to understand that answer in a way I hadn't expected. Maybe because Vietnamese has different tolerances for not fully explaining yourself. She told me things too. Not all at once and not in a confessional way. In the way that information comes out when 2 people spend real time together, incidentally mid-conversation, sometimes while looking at something else. She'd grown up in Can Tho in the Mekong Delta. Her father had worked construction most of his life, the kind of work that destroys your knees and your back in exchange for enough to get by. Her mother had sold vegetables in the market until the knees went. Her younger brother still lived there, working at a factory outside the city. There was a niece she was particularly close to, her brother's daughter, 7 years old, apparently demanding and very funny. She talked about her family the way people talk about something they both love and feel responsible for. Not performing it. Just matter of fact, the way you mention your circumstances rather than your feelings. I noted that she had strong family ties. I noted this as a positive thing. My ex-wife had maintained a careful, polished distance from her own family that I'd once mistaken for self-sufficiency and later understood was indifference. I had told myself after the divorce that warmth toward family was a character indicator. I was not wrong about that. I just drew the wrong conclusion about what that warmth would eventually require of me. I want to be honest about something else because I told you I'd be precise, and I should extend that to the uncomfortable parts as well. I had been alone, properly alone, not just physically alone, but without any sustained connection to another person who was actually interested in me, for the better part of 2 years before I met her. The divorce, then the redundancy, then the bedsit. People checked in occasionally. My sister in Cork texted every few weeks. A friend from the firm sent a WhatsApp about a match sometimes. It wasn't nothing. But it wasn't the sustained, particular attention of someone who chooses to spend their time with you and seems genuinely to want to know what you think about things. I hadn't realized how much I missed that until it was there again. That's the honest version. Not that she swept me off my feet. More that I'd been running on empty for long enough that a regular supply felt like abundance. And so by June I had stopped, mostly, doing the accounting I'd told myself I was doing. I was spending perhaps 5,000 dong here, 12,000 there. Dinners, taxis, 2 cinema trips, a book one bought her from a shop on Jin Tian Huang and District 1 that she'd mentioned. She'd been talking about the author and then said offhand that she hadn't been able to find that particular one, and I ordered it online and brought it the following Tuesday. She held it for a moment and then looked at me in a way that Look, it was a good moment. That's all I'll say. It was a good moment. 3 months of this added up to roughly 1,200 euro in total. Meals, the Vung Tao weekend, the book, and a couple of other small things. A day trip we took to the Coochie tunnels because she said she'd never actually been, despite living in Saigon 12 years, which we both found funny. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make you look twice in a monthly report. Then, in late June, she called me one evening. Not a Zalo message, an actual call, which she didn't usually do. Her voice was careful in the way people are careful when they've been thinking about how to say something. Her mother in Can Tho needed dental work. 2 teeth, the back ones? The estimate from the dentist was 8 million dong, roughly 290 euro. I said that was fine. I said it immediately without deliberating. And here's the thing I've thought about since. I didn't hesitate because I was being careless. I hesitated for perhaps 1 second, and in that second, I actually ran a brief mental calculation. Is this a reasonable ask? Is this the beginning of a pattern? Does 8 million dong for dental work track with actual dental costs in the provinces? It did, roughly. I'd read enough to know that rural healthcare is expensive relative to local incomes. And then I thought, this is a test of some kind, and I'm going to pass it. Because 290 euro is not a meaningful sum relative to what I have, and refusing it would say something about me that I didn't want to be true. I used the word test in my own head. I thought, this is a test. As if I were the examiner. The money transferred that evening. She thanked me in a message that was warm and not excessive. No strings of grateful emojis. Just a few lines that said she appreciated it and that her mother would be relieved. I read the message and thought, this is a reasonable woman managing a real situation sensibly. That was month 4. The dental payment was 8 million dong, 290 euro. I spent more time analyzing that figure than I care to admit. I cross-referenced provincial dental costs. I considered the ask relative to what I knew of her salary. I constructed, in my head, a small cost-benefit framework around generosity. And then I moved on, which is the thing I should have done less of, moving on. Every accountant knows you don't close a ledger entry by deciding the amount looks acceptable. You close it when you understand what it represents. I understood the amount. I had no idea what it represented. In July, Lynn suggested moving in together. She framed it practically, which was how she framed most things. My apartment in District 7 was larger than her place in Bintan. The rent on hers plus the rent on mine was more than the rent on mine alone. We were spending most of our time together anyway. The logic was correct. I built a small spreadsheet to confirm the logic was correct, which it was, because I had constructed the parameters to confirm what I'd already decided. She moved in at the beginning of August. I covered the 18 million dong monthly, roughly €660. She covered groceries, which ran to about 2 million a week. I had it on a spreadsheet. In one column, my outgoings. In another, hers. The columns were technically balanced in the way that mattered to me. The spreadsheet was correct. The spreadsheet missed the point entirely. I won't pretend living with her wasn't good. It was. She cooked on weekends. Proper meals, nothing performative, just food she actually ate. Canned chua, the sweet and sour fish soup with tamarind, the kind that smells of the Mekong Delta even in a District 7 apartment. Thit ko tao, pork braised in coconut water that she made on Sunday evenings and that improved through the week. I learned to make the rice properly because she showed me once, and I am constitutionally unable to be shown something and not master it. We had a routine. It was, by most reasonable measures, a functioning domestic life. Month 6, September. She came to me one evening while I was reading and said her brother Min needed a motorbike. Not wanted, needed. He worked at a factory on the outskirts of Can Tho, she explained, and the buses didn't run early enough for his shift. And he'd been cycling in the dark on a road with no lights, and this had apparently been going on for months, and he hadn't said anything because he didn't want to cause trouble. I asked questions. Which factory? How far? What had he been using before? She answered all of them directly without irritation at being asked. The factory made agricultural equipment, she said, about 6 kilometers from the family home. He'd been using an old bicycle their father had kept. The bicycle had a wheel that was slowly collapsing. 32 million dong for a decent second-hand Honda Wave, about €1,170. I paid it. And I want you to understand that I don't regret the payment in itself. A man cycling 6 kilometers in the dark on a collapsing bicycle to a factory job is a man who needs a motorbike. And €1,100 is €1,100, not 11,000. What I regret is the accounting I did around it. I asked the right questions. I satisfied myself with the answers. I filed it under legitimate family expense within parameters. I did not ask the broader question, which was, am I now the primary financial resource for a family I have never met? Month 7, October. School fees for the niece. 5 million dong, about €180. Lynn mentioned it over dinner the same way you might mention that you need to pick up something from the shops. The niece was 7, apparently bright. The school wanted the next semester's fees by the end of the month. I said fine without putting down my fork. I think about that moment sometimes, not with regret exactly, more with the mild exasperation I usually reserve for other people's oversights. I should have asked at least one question. I didn't ask any. Month 8, November. The roof. The family home in Can Tho had been showing problems with the roof for several years. Not structural, Lynn was careful to clarify, just water coming in at one corner during heavy rain and causing problems with damp. Her father's arthritis was worsening, and he couldn't work on it himself. Her brother was saving, but slowly. The family had gotten an estimate, about 220 million dong for a full renovation, €8,000 roughly. Lynn suggested I might contribute half. This was the first time I negotiated. I'm not sure whether to be proud of this or mortified by it. I said I was happy to contribute to a targeted repair rather than a full renovation, and that I'd be comfortable with 93 million dong, about €3,400, toward fixing the specific damaged section rather than the whole roof. Lynn considered this and said she'd talk to her parents. 2 days later, she said they'd agreed. I felt genuinely like I'd handled that well, like I'd applied professional judgment to a personal situation and arrived at a fair outcome. I'd reviewed the scope, challenged the initial figure, negotiated a reasonable compromise. 22 years of auditing other people's invoices and I could spot an inflated estimate, even in a family context. That's what got me. I had started at some point I couldn't precisely identify thinking of it as my family. Not consciously, I wasn't making declarations about it, but the mental model had shifted. I was a partner in a family structure, making considered contributions to its maintenance. I was the person with the financial resources and the skills to apply them sensibly. It felt responsible. It felt, if I'm being entirely honest, like it felt to be useful to people who needed you. I think about a conversation we had around this time. We were at a Quan Hao near the Pu Mai Hung roundabout. Low plastic stools and bottles of 333 beer and the smell of grilling meat from the table next to us. She was talking about her parents, about her father specifically, how he'd worked 30 years in construction and still had nothing to show for it except a house that leaked when it rained. She said it without complaint, just as a fact about how things were. I understood every word, and I understood, listening to her, that the story was true. Her father had worked construction his whole life in the Mekong Delta. That was real. That was the family she came from. I think what I failed to understand was what my understanding meant to her. I knew the story was true. I assumed that knowing it was true and choosing to help was a simple moral transaction. I didn't ask what kind of help was expected, how much, for how long, and by what mechanism it would eventually stop. I should ask you, had I met the family by this point? No. A visit to Can Tho had come up in conversation several times. Lynn mentioned that her parents were curious about me, that her mother had asked questions. We'd discussed going in month 6 and then again in month 7, and each time something had come up with her work schedule. A logistics crunch, a colleague sick. I noticed the deferral. I filed it somewhere I didn't look at often. At the end of November, I had been with Lynn for 8 months. I had contributed across all the requests plus 11 months of rent. I'd extended my tenancy twice at this point, approximately €10,000 in direct asks, and another €4,000 in rent contributions. €14,000 in total. I hadn't opened the full spreadsheet recently. And then, in December, her mother asked, through Lynn, relayed to me over tea in the apartment one evening, presented carefully not as a demand but as a question from people who were beginning to think about the future, whether I had any thoughts about marriage. Not from Lynn, from her family. I would come to understand that this distinction meant rather less than I thought it did. The marriage question sat between us for a few days, which Lynn seemed comfortable with and which I appreciated. She didn't press. She didn't frame it as urgent. She mentioned it once more, briefly, saying her parents asked because they cared about her future, not because they were rushing anyone. I said I understood that, which I did, which was part of the problem. I had, in fact, read enough about Vietnamese family culture to know that this was not unusual. A 38-year-old woman from a provincial family, 12 years in Saigon, no previous marriage, her parents' question about intentions was not a cultural anomaly. It was, by most measures, a reasonable parental concern. I knew this. I factored it in. I told myself that understanding the context made me better equipped to navigate it. This was the first of several moments where being informed was not the same as being wise. The trip to Quan Tho happened in January, month 9 of the relationship. We took the bus from Mien Tai Station, 4 hours down into the Delta. The landscape changed as you went south, flatter, greener, the road lined with rice paddies and the occasional roadside shrine. Lynn slept most of the way with her head against the window. I watched the countryside and thought, not for the first time, that I had made a reasonable decision coming here. The family home was in a residential lane about 20 minutes by motorbike from the city center. Small, single-story, the kind of house built incrementally over decades with whatever materials were available at the time. The front wall was a different texture from the side wall, which suggested an extension at some point. There was a small altar just inside the door, a photograph of an older man I didn't recognize above it, incense burning in a holder. The smell of incense and something cooking, con chua as it turned out, which Lynn's mother had made because she knew I'd eaten it at home and wanted to make something familiar. The parents were warm. I believe that. Lynn's father was a man in his late 60s who moved carefully, the way people move when their joints have made their opinion clear about certain activities. He shook my hand with both of his and said something in Vietnamese that Lynn translated as welcome to our home. Her mother was shorter, quicker, watching me with the frank curiosity of someone who has been wondering about you for months and is now conducting her assessment. The brother, Min, whose motorbike I had funded, was shy and polite, and spent most of the visit slightly out of the room. The niece was exactly as described, demanding and very funny, She showed me her school report card with the directness of someone presenting credentials and waited for my reaction. I told her in Vietnamese that it was very good work. She looked at me for a moment, recalibrating, and then laughed. I ate at the family table. Rice, can chua, a braised pork dish, vegetables. Simple food, well made. The kind of meal that has a specific taste that I associate now with a specific feeling. Something between belonging and grief, which is an uncomfortable combination, and one I've had some time to sit with since. I was asked questions, most of which came through Lynn's translation. What did I do for work? Whether I liked Vietnam? Whether I found the food different from Ireland? Normal questions, easy questions. I answered them. At one point, Lynn's mother said something longer, and I caught most of it before Lynn translated a shorter version. Her mother had said something about hoping her daughter would have security and a settled future. And Lynn translated this as her mother saying she hoped I was enjoying my time in Cantho. I noticed the gap. I filed it. That's the thing I think about most from that visit. Not any single moment of warmth or transaction, just the gap between what was said and what was translated, and the fact that I noticed it and filed it and kept eating. I sat in their living room on a low plastic stool with a glass of iced tea and looked at this family. The careful father, the watchful mother, the shy brother, the 7-year-old presenting her school report with the confidence of a board member. And I thought, this is what I came here for. Not adventure, not escape, just this. People in a room together belonging to each other. That thought is the one that cost me the most. The house proposal came about 3 weeks after we returned to Saigon in late January. Lynn sat down with me one evening and explained it carefully, the way she explained things when she'd prepared herself. Her parents were getting older. The family home had the roof problems they'd been managing, but there were also longer-term concerns. Her father's health, her mother's knees, the practical difficulty of aging in a house that needed maintenance they couldn't manage themselves. The idea was a modest property, something closer to the city center of Con Tho, somewhere easier. A small house, 2 bedrooms, manageable garden. The estimate from a property agent she'd spoken to was roughly 600 million dong, 22,000 euro. She said it could be in her name or her parents' name. I would not, she noted, as a foreign national, be able to hold the title myself. This was presented as a practical fact, not a warning. As a foreign national, I could not own land in Vietnam. She was simply being clear about the administrative reality. I was aware of this law. I had researched it before I left Limerick. I said I needed some time to think. I opened a new spreadsheet that night. First time in months that I'd done a proper accounting. I went through everything. 11 months of rent at 18 million per month. 7,260 euro. The dental surgery, 290. The motorbike, 1,170. The school fees, 180. The roof repair, 3,400. Daily living costs attributable to the relationship, meals I'd covered, the Can Tho trip, incidentals, roughly 2,600. Total, approximately 28,000 euro. I looked at it for a while. Then I put 22,000 beside it. Combined, 50,000 euro. Of 58,000, 8,000 remaining. I closed the spreadsheet and didn't open it again for 3 days. For a man who built his professional life on the principle that you look at the numbers until you understand what they mean, 3 days of not opening a spreadsheet is, well, it's what it is. I knew what the numbers meant. I needed 3 days before I was willing to sit with knowing it. I went for a drink at a bar near my apartment one evening during those 3 days. A small place on a side street, mostly locals, a few expats. I ended up talking to an Englishman named Derek who'd been in HCMC 4 years, retired, and who had the specific quality of someone who had seen several versions of the same film and knew the plot. He asked casually how things were going with the girl. I said fine, we were talking about the future. He nodded slowly, took a sip, then said, just make sure you know what the future looks like from her side, mate. I thanked him and changed the subject. I think about Derek occasionally. He didn't say anything I didn't already know. That's the thing about advice. It rarely tells you something new. It just says out loud the thing you've been not quite saying to yourself. I changed the subject because I didn't want the thing said out loud. I wasn't ready. A few evenings later, I was washing up after dinner. Rice bowls, chopsticks, the pan from the thit ko tao she'd made. The window above the sink looked out onto the power lines and the dark street below, and there was a motorbike horn somewhere. and the distant sound of someone's television. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a life that had come to feel familiar. Lynn was in the next room on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I was washing up. Her voice was different. I noticed it the way you notice a figure that doesn't match the column it's supposed to be in. Not with alarm, just with the quiet attention of someone whose job is to notice. She was speaking more quickly than she spoke to her mother. Lower. The Vietnamese? Of someone who isn't performing for an audience. I kept washing up. The water was running. I wasn't leaning toward the doorway or holding still. I was just at the sink with the bowls in the pan, and I was listening the way I'd been listening for 11 months, passively, the way you absorb a language before you can produce it. I caught the phrase Nguoi Island Gya, the old Irish man. She used it the way you'd refer to a project at work. Not unkindly, not affectionately, just precisely, descriptively. I was, to whoever she was speaking to, the old Irish man. And the conversation was about timelines. I pieced it together over the next few minutes, standing at the sink with the water still running. The house contribution, whether I was close to agreeing, whether I would commit before my visa renewal came up, because my tourist visa was on a 90-day cycle and the next extension would require either a border run or a different arrangement. Whether she thought the timeline was realistic. The other voice laughed at something I didn't fully catch. Lynn said something short in response. I got the tone of it more than the words. Reassurance, I think, that she had it in hand. The call ended. I heard her put the phone down on the table. I turned the tap off. I dried my hands. I stood at the sink for what felt like a long time, but was probably 2 minutes. I want to be clear about what I felt because I've had 8 months to examine it, and I think clarity is owed here. I wasn't angry. There was no dramatic moment of betrayal, no specific sensation I could point to. It was more like the feeling of finishing an audit and finding that the totals reconcile, but the methodology was wrong from the start. The answer looks right. The process was flawed. You missed something fundamental in how the question was being asked. I went to bed. I didn't confront her that night. She came to bed an hour later and I was, by then, apparently asleep. The following 2 weeks I behaved entirely normally. This is the part people find hard to believe, but it isn't complicated if you understand how I function. I needed data before I could act on anything. One conversation partially heard was not sufficient. I was an accountant. I didn't close a file on one entry, so I listened. Properly. With the specific, attentive patience I had learned across 22 years of finding things that didn't want to be found. Most of what I heard was ordinary. Her talking to her mother. Warm, easy. The comfortable rhythm of people who speak to each other every day and mostly say nothing important. Laughing with the niece on a Zalo video call, the niece apparently having opinions about a classmate that Lynn found hilarious. These were the calls that made the whole thing harder to process, because they were just a woman talking to her family. Just ordinary love. Real. But twice more over those 2 weeks I heard the lower register, the different pace. And twice I heard references to Annie A, him, meaning me, in a tone that I can only describe as administrative, responsible even. The tone of someone who is managing a situation carefully and taking it seriously. Not callous, not gleeful, just practical. Once, I heard a figure mentioned that corresponded to the house. I let it run for 14 days, then I made a decision. I chose a Tuesday evening, no particular reason. She was at the table with her laptop, working on something for her job, and I sat down across from her and waited until she looked up. And then I started speaking to her in Vietnamese. Not the careful, halting Vietnamese I'd let her believe was the extent of what I had. Proper Vietnamese. The Vietnamese I'd been building for 8 months before I ever landed in this country. I said, I think there are things you haven't told me. I said, I've understood more of our life together than you realized. I said, I'm not angry. I'm asking you to be honest with me. She went completely still. It was a particular kind of stillness. Not guilt exactly, more like the moment when a calculation you've been running in one direction suddenly has to reverse. She sat with it for a few seconds, which told me she was processing rather than preparing a denial. Then she cried. I watched this carefully, not from coldness, but from the habit of assessment I apparently cannot turn off, even at moments that probably deserve something more human. She was crying, and she was also, I noticed, watching my face, looking for what I knew and what I was going to do with it. This was not performance. I don't think it was, not primarily. The tears seemed real. Her hands were shaking slightly. But the watching was also real. Both things, simultaneously. She didn't deny the calculations. She said, and this I'll give her, this was the most honest thing she said in the whole conversation, that she did care for me, genuinely, and that she had also needed to find a way to secure her family's future, and that in her understanding of how the world worked, those two things were not in conflict. They were not opposites. They were both just true. She said her parents were getting old. She said her brother couldn't support them alone. She said she was 38 and had been in Saigon 12 years and had nothing to show for it in terms of what her family needed. She said she had been a good partner to me. She said this was not a lie. And here is the part one keep returning to 8 months later, in a flat in Limerick that is not Dora Doyle. She was not entirely wrong. She had been, in ways that mattered, a good partner. The attention was real. The corrections of my Vietnamese tones, the can chua on weekends, the way she listened, actually listened when I talked about the divorce in the gradual way I sometimes did, obliquely, and she never pushed, but she always understood. These things were real, I am certain of it. And the timeline existed. The house was a target. The visa renewal was a factor in the calculation. Both, simultaneously. I don't have a spreadsheet column for that. I stayed another 2 weeks after the confrontation. This will strike some people as inexplicable. It was necessary. We existed in the apartment with a different understanding between us. Not hostile, not warm, just honest in a way we hadn't been before. She didn't mention the house again. I didn't bring it up. We ate meals. We were polite. One evening she laughed at something I said in Vietnamese and then stopped herself, and neither of us commented on it. At the end of the second week, I told her I was going home. She nodded. She said she understood. She said she was sorry, in a way that I believed, and which didn't change anything. I booked the flight that night, packed over 2 days. 11 months of a life fits into surprisingly little, which is either freeing or depressing depending on how you look at it. I chose not to look at it either way. I was an accountant. I processed the transaction and closed the file. The final morning I made coffee, the small espresso maker she'd bought for the apartment. I stood at the window above the sink one last time, looking at the power lines in the street below, already loud with motorbikes, and the distant call of a banh mi vendor working the corner. The city entirely indifferent to the particular small reckoning happening 4 floors above it. I left without a scene. She was still asleep. The flight home was 14 hours with a connection in Doha. I remember the Doha airport specifically, the air conditioning set to a temperature that seemed designed to remind you that you were no longer somewhere warm, and a coffee that cost €7 and tasted of nothing in particular. I sat in the terminal and looked at my phone and did not message anyone. I landed in Dublin on a Tuesday morning in February. Gray. Cold in the specific way that Irish of February is cold, which is not dramatic cold, just a persistent, low-level insistence that you are not somewhere comfortable. My sister had offered to collect me. I told her I'd get the train. I took a flat in Castle Troy, different from the bedsit, a proper one-bedroom on the first floor of a newer building, which cost more but which I could justify given the circumstances. By which I mean I needed the circumstances to feel like something had changed. It had changed. I was €27,000 lighter and 11 months older, and I was back in Limerick on a Tuesday in February. Some things had changed. The financial accounting took me one evening. I'm going to give you the full figure because precision is the one habit I've kept without question. 11 months of rent at 18 million dong per month, €7,260. Dental surgery, 290. Motorbike, 1,170. School fees, 180. Roof repair, 3,400. The Can Tho trip, meals I'd covered across 11 months, incidentals, the 2 cinema trips, the book, small things that don't look like anything individually, roughly 2,600 conservatively. Total outgoing attributable to the relationship, approximately €31,000. I started with 58. I have roughly 27. I am not destitute. I want to be clear about that because I know some of the stories on channels like this one end with a man who has lost everything. I haven't lost everything. I've lost a significant portion of what I had, and I've lost the particular confidence that comes from believing you are the kind of person who checks his work. That second loss is harder to put a figure on. The question I've been asked by my sister and by two friends who now know what happened and probably wish they didn't is, was it real? I've had 8 months to work on an answer, and what I've arsat you